In Colombia, the counting process of the legislative elections continues after the National Registry Office dismissed a request for a recount of the Senate votes. Bolivian President Luis Arce heads the acts for the Day of the Sea, ratifying his commitment to recover sovereign access to the sea. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian met with his Syrian counterpart to discuss matters of bilateral relations. Hi, this is From the South. I am your news anchor, Dio Martin, from the Telsur studios in Havana. We begin with the news. In Colombia, the counting process of the legislative elections continues after the National Registry Office dismissed a request for a recount of the Senate votes. The Scrutiny Commission is reviewing the electoral forms in order to conclude the counting process to certify the number of seats for each party and subsequently hand out the credentials to the elected congressman. The scrutiny continues after the National Register rolled out requesting a recount of the votes of the Senate elections. This request was made by President Ivan Duque, alleging irregularities in the elections. In this regard, the National Registry called on the population to trust the electoral results and dismiss the possibility of fraud. Now, Ecuadorian workers will march on Wednesday to protest government actions that, according to the union, are detrimental to broad sectors of the population. The mobilization was called on by the United Front of Ecuadorian Workers for this afternoon. Activists will reject the government's attempts to privatize strategic sectors for the development of the country. They will also condemn corruption and defend social security, national sovereignty, and nature. They will also be condemning mining, the sale of the Pacific Bank, and the bill to attract investments. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador will also be joining the demonstration, as well as the workers from the oil and electricity sectors. And the Secretary General of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, Sasha Llorenti, began his official 5-day visit to Cuba. Llorenti has an intense work agenda in Havana, where he will evaluate the progress of social and economic programs that benefit hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans. Upon his arrival in the island, the Secretary General of the regional organization said it was a real pleasure to be back in the land of Martí and Fidel. From his Twitter account, Llorenti highlighted the meetings with professors, academics, and students from the Raúl Roa Garcia Higher Institute of International Relations and the International Policy Research Center. Meanwhile, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez expressed his gratitude to the Latin American Integration Mechanism for its support to Cuba, especially in times where the COVID-19 pandemic affects the entire world severely. And the United Nations warned that Haiti has one of the highest levels of food insecurity in the world, with 4.4 million Haitians, nearly half the population, in need of immediate food assistance, and among these 1.2 million suffer from severe hunger. According to the World Food Program, one of the drivers of food insecurity is the poor performance of the agricultural sector and the heavy dependence on food imports, which account for more than half of the food and specifically 83% of the rice consumed. This makes the country vulnerable to inflation and price volatility in international markets. These issues have been exacerbated by a series of natural disasters over the past 2 decades, including severe storms, flooding, landslides, drought, the devastating earthquake in 2010, and Category 4 Hurricane Matthew, which left around 800,000 people in need of urgent food assistance in 2016. And in Chile, high school students and victims of human rights violations reached an agreement to lift the seizure of the National Human Rights Institute and to hand over the building to its workers. The measure comes after 8 months of peaceful occupation of the building and 1 day before an eviction by the police. The Coordinating Assembly of High School Students and Civil Organizations agreed with the country's Undersecretary of Human Rights to create a working group to seek comprehensive reparation for the victims and families affected by violence in the social outbreak. In addition, the organizations demanded the resignation of the director of the Human Rights Institute, Sergio Mico, and the application of justice against those responsible for the repression against the Chilean people.
The rhetoric of impunity was not isolated in the 90s or in the process. It was evidence in the mechanism of impunity that are promoted to us only for being individuals. They are present in the same structures that sustain these institutions. Since from these institutions, the interests of important businessmen represented. The same businessmen that have deprived of wealth the working class of our country. The most recent example is the behavior of the Special Armed Forces in the latest protest in Dignity Square, where a demonstrator was severely injured due to police actions. If this happens in spite of new government took office, that claim commitment with human rights. The measures should be much more decisive, such as the dissolution of the Carabineros.
On the other hand, workers of the National Institute for Human Rights were able to access their building and celebrated the idea of setting up a table for the integral reparation of victims of the social unrests.
Today we have a guarantee that a work table will be set up. That is a table of comprehensive reparation in which all the people who are willing to do so will participate. We did not have these guarantees in the previous period, and that is a guarantee that we are going to raise as a great victory. There has also been a commitment to approach the work of reparation in an integral way, addressing even other matters, health, labor, education, integral reparation. The rights are interconnected, and we welcome that.
And during International Water Day, hundreds of Chileans demonstrated in the streets of the nation's capital, Santiago, demanding a reform in the regulation of the supply of water. Demonstrators denounced that the current law dates from the era of dictator Pinochet in the 1980s and that since then private ownership of water rights has been maintained. This model of water ownership is being debated by the convention drafting the new constitution, where some have suggested to include water as a public and basic good for humans. On his behalf, the recently inaugurated President Gabriel Boric said Tuesday that the country must advance towards a model that safeguards water access as a human right in the context of an unprecedented drought spanning for over 13 years.
We want to put into the public debate our proposal that is to make water public, which has been our traditional claim since 2012. This is a social, economic, environmental movement.
If water today is a global struggle, in Chile it has even been deeper significance. Because here, the drought is promoted by historical plundering that was established by the water law in 1980. We are fighting for water to stop being private. We are the only place in the world where water can be bought, sold, leased, and even mortgaged.
We're going to take a short break now. Please join us again after this. Hi and welcome back to From the South. The Bolivian President Luis Arce heads the acts for the Day of the Sea, ratifying his commitment to recover maritime sovereign access. The 143rd anniversary celebrations for the defense of Calama began with a wreath laying at the foot of the statue of Eduardo Baroa, hero of the War of the Pacific. The Bolivian president was accompanied by the Vice President David Choquehuanca, ministers of state, and some members of the diplomatic corps accredited in the country. During his speech, Arce recalled that the aggression that stripped them of their maritime territory responded to the imperialist interests of England over the natural resources of this region.
In 1879, the Chilean military invasion of the Bolivian ports dragged our country into a war between brotherly peoples, which it neither wanted nor sought, in which we lost thousands of lives. It was a war caused by England's desire to have control of two fundamental resources for the agricultural revolution in Europe, saltpeter and guano, the basic elements for the manufacture of fertilizers. It was a war of aggression in which the Chilean oligarchies were at the service of English interests and had armed themselves according to their intentions of territorial occupation.
The Bolivian president also expressed his desire to reach an agreement on this issue with Chilean President Gabriel Boric.
The progressive government has recently taken over the leadership of our sister Republic of Chile, and the Chilean people is moving forward in a historic constitutional assembly. We hope that under the leadership of brother President Gabriel Boric, the isolation of the Bolivian people will end, an open wound to our great homeland lasting 143 years.
Now, the Indigenous Missionary Council in Brazil once again denounced before the United Nations the pain, suffering, and agony of indigenous peoples caused by acts of violence committed against them. The Executive Secretary of the Missionary Council, Antonio Eduardo de Oliveira, addressed Bolsonaro's administration's role in aggravating human rights violations during the COVID-19 pandemic. He said it is an alarming situation that worsens each day because, in addition to the threats of the virus, indigenous peoples confronted racism, illegal deforestation, agribusinesses, land grabbing, and many other crimes that continue to advance into their territories. For some decades now, violence against indigenous peoples have been directly linked to incentives provided by the Brazilian government to political groups associated with transnational economic conglomerates seeking easy and enormous profits. President Vladimir Putin said on Wednesday that Russia will only accept payments in rubles for gas deliveries to unfriendly countries, which include all EU members, after Moscow was hit by unprecedented sanctions over Ukraine.
In this context, it does not make any sense for us to supply our goods to both the European Union and the United States and to receive payments in dollars, euros, or other currencies. So I have decided to implement a set of measures of transfer payments in a very short time. We will start by transferring payments for our natural gas supplies to the so-called unfriendly countries, the Russian rubles. This means abandoning the use of all compromised currencies in these payments. At the same time, I would like to stress separately that Russia will continue to unconditionally supply natural gas in accordance with the volumes and pricing principles set out in the contracts concluded earlier.
Rocket and mortar attacks are being waged in the middle of fierce fighting in Donetsk's Marinka, a region caught in the crossfire amid the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Marinka, a town located just 35 kilometers from the capital of the self-proclaimed Republic of Donetsk, has been devastated by shelling and gunfire amid fighting between local militia and Ukrainian forces. The region has become one of the places in the Donbass region where fighting has been the most intense in recent days. A soldier of the Donetsk militia said the group continues its battle against the Ukrainian forces and emphasized that a slow but steady advance is being made. The president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, plans to ask NATO to send a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. According to the local Onet Wiadomości portal, the Polish president will submit his proposal at a meeting of the North Atlantic Alliance to be held on Thursday, March 24th in Brussels.
Given what has happened in Ukraine, given Russian unprecedented aggression against this free, independent, sovereign country, given the advancing occupation of Ukraine's lands, given the crisis that is related to this, also a security crisis for us, but also for all of Europe, and we can even say that for the whole world, we need a new concept of NATO. And that is why our meeting now, before the nearest NATO summit that will be held in 2 days' time in Brussels, is so very important.
In this context, on Wednesday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned that sending NATO troops to Ukraine would lead to a direct confrontation between the Russian armed forces and the U.S.-led alliance. He said, quote-unquote, "I hope they understand what this means. This will be a direct confrontation between the Russian army and NATO forces, precisely the one thing everyone said they wanted to avoid. Moreover, that it should never happen." Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also accused the United States of wanting to hinder Moscow's talks with Ukraine aimed at ending the almost month-long conflict.
Talks started. They're tough. The Ukrainian side, although it understands that some things need to be agreed during the negotiations, constantly changes its position, rejects its own proposals. It's hard to avoid the impression that our American colleagues are holding their hand.
On Wednesday, Poland expelled the 45 Russian diplomats for espionage, an allegation immediately dismissed as baseless by Russia's ambassador to Poland. The announcement was made by Polish Interior Minister Mariusz Kaminski, explaining that bilateral diplomatic relations remained in place. Russian ambassador to Poland, Sergei Andreev, confirmed the expulsions, telling reporters that the individuals concerned had been given 5 days to leave the country, but emphasized there were no grounds for those accusations. The announcement came hours after Poland's counter-espionage service identified the alleged spies and called on the foreign ministry to expel them. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Tuesday referred to the conflict in Ukraine and said that his government is making efforts with his counterparts Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky to cease hostilities.
The humanitarian drama in Ukraine continues to escalate. Thousands of civilians lost their lives, more than 3 million people fled their country and sought refuge in neighboring countries. In order to stop this course of events, we're pursuing an intense diplomacy traffic. I'm continuing my talks with Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin.
On the other hand, after a meeting with Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, the Turkish leader asked the European Union to renew his country's negotiations to be part of the bloc.
Recent global developments have reintroduced the added value of accession of Turkey to the European Union. We expect the European Union to open quickly the chapters of the membership negotiations and to start negotiations on a customs union without yielding to cynical calculations of interests.
In the United States, a tornado left at least one person dead, multiple damages to infrastructure, and thousands of people without electricity in the Louisiana city of New Orleans. The powerful twister touched down and ripped through the city late Tuesday afternoon. Local authorities said a search has been launched for residents who may be trapped under the rubble of their collapsed homes. St. Bernard Parish authorities reported one person dead and several injured. The storm affected communities that were already devastated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The tornado left New Orleans before 8 p.m. as it headed eastwards, unleashing strong winds, hail, and rain. We have more news coming up after a final short break. Please stay with us. Hi and welcome back. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian met with his Syrian counterpart to discuss matters of bilateral relations. The foreign ministers discussed the current situation in Ukraine regarding Russia's special military operation and other developments during a meeting in Damascus. During his visit, Amir Abdollahian also talked about the latest developments in Iran's negotiations to restore Tehran's nuclear deal with world powers, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's visit to the United Arab Emirates last week, which marked his first to an Arab country since the Syria war broke out, and meetings of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva between the Syrian government and the opposition. Thousands of residents of Gaza queue daily and are forced to use the Erez crossing to enter Israel for work due to the high unemployment rates caused by the extended blockade promoted by Tel Aviv. The Palestinian territory, inhabited by some 2.5 million people, has been under Israeli siege since 2007, resulting in unemployment rates of up to 50%. The hardships are suffered even by those with university degrees who are also tempted to receive higher pay if they enter the quota provided by the occupation authorities. While local producers and entrepreneurs have to cope with difficulties in acquiring inputs, testimonies indicate that on the Israeli side, salaries are up to 5 or 6 times higher.
The situation is bad. May God help the people, whether for working students or young unemployed graduates. I'm obliged at the age of 65 to go work within the Green Line, that is Israeli border, to earn a living for my unemployed sons.
The Afghan government ordered the closing of schools for Afghan girls hours after reopening. This comes after the Taliban authorities announced a reopening of junior high schools more than 7 months after seizing power and imposing harsh restrictions on women's rights to education. All schools had been closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic when the Taliban seized power late August, but only boys and some younger girls were able to resume classes 2 months later. The international community has made the right to education for all a major point in negotiations over aid and recognition of the new regime. And a Chinese aviation official said on Wednesday that one of the 2 black box data recorders of Chinese Eastern Airlines flight that crashed with 132 people on board last Monday was found in severely damaged conditions. The head of the Accident Investigation Division of the Chinese Civil Aviation Authority, Mao Yanfeng, said the device is so damaged that investigators have not been able to tell if it is a flight data recorder or the cockpit voice recorder. The search to find the other box and human remains is still underway. Recovering the so-called black boxes is considered key to determine the cause of the accident. The search had been suspended earlier Wednesday due to heavy rain and its effect on the site of the crash.
The weather conditions when the aircraft was on the route were normal, and the Air Traffic Control Department did not receive any report of dangerous weather conditions. As for the communications that you mentioned, the communication records between the crew and the Air Traffic Control Department showed that the plane had maintained normal air-ground communications with the Air Traffic Control Department before its altitude suddenly dropped after taking off from Cumming. After the sudden descent of the plane, the Air Traffic Control Department did not receive any signal of distress or abnormal situation from the crew until the plane disappeared from the Air Traffic Control Department radar monitoring.
We've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at Telstra English. You can also join us on social media for all the latest news. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For Telstra English, I'm Dio Martin. Thanks for watching.